You are listening to From the Sea, a podcast series produced by South China Sea Studies. This program provides valuable insights from experts around the world on geopolitical and security developments, with regards to the South China Sea as an area and a connected maritime landscape. In today's episode, Dr. Giulio Pugliese, lecturer at the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies from the University of Oxford, will have a chat with our host about the topic of the EU's presence and involvement in Indo-Pacific in general and the South China Sea in particular.
Oh, hello everybody, this is Hoang from the ISIS Institute and welcome to the From the Sea podcast. And today I have here with me Dr. Giulio Pugliese, lecturer from Oxford School of Global and Area Studies, University of Oxford. Dr. Pugliese is also a part-time professor at European University Institute. It's a pleasure to have you here at this beautiful beach town in Da Nang.
Thank you. Yes, it's beautiful to hear and it's a real privilege to be invited to Da Nang.
Thank you so much. Yes. So I would just like to go straight into the topic of ours today, which is the EU presence, the EU involvement in the Indo-Pacific in general and in the South China Sea in particular. You recently wrote an article on the EU policy in the Indo-Pacific, in which you characterize EU policy as a mixture of mercantilism and multilateralism. Would you mind elaborating on that again?
Sure. Well, thanks for pitching my article, which was just published for the Journal of Intervention in State Building, and it's open access for everybody to read. This article stems from a Track 1.5 dialogue that was held in Rome with French, Italian, Japanese and Korean participants through the sponsorship of this European project called Enhancing Security Cooperation in and with Asia, ESIWA. And it's part and parcel of the European Union's growing security involvement in the region, which is a new trend. The Indo-Pacific has been a dirty word in Brussels at its early inception, precisely because of the strong power political connotations, specifically those that stemmed from the Trump administration's maximalist pushback against China, and the fear of self-fulfilling prophecies and really of deglobalization and decoupling. And what has been fascinating to notice is that with time, along with a more inclusive approach and declination of the Indo-Pacific concept, and I can think of the 2019 ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, the European Union, starting with France, which is a resident power, hence Germany and the Netherlands in the 2020, have churned out policy papers, guidelines on the Indo-Pacific. And this stemmed in a trilateral effort from these three European key players, Germany, the Netherlands and France especially, to churn out a strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, which resulted in the adoption in April of 2021 by the Council of the EU and eventually a joint communication from the European Commissioner and the High Representative of a proper strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. And there is a strong component of that strategy that pinpoints, at security, specifically maritime security and maritime security engagement, but in connection with other agenda items, specifically the need to preserve a multilateral open economy, free trade systems premised on bilateral FTAs between the EU and Indo-Pacific players, Indo-Pacific economies, and also the willingness on the European side to push for green transition and digital transition. And I posted in this article that the growing presence, which should be understood especially at the member state level, so at the member state level, sending, deploying or letting transit assets at sea or on air in the region, which is broadly defined from the eastern shores of Africa, of the African continent, to the Pacific island states, to showcase commitment to the maintainment of freedom of navigation and freedom of overflight, but at the same time to reap the benefits of a key region which is central to global peace and prosperity, because before the pandemic, 60% of the world economy's growth actually stemmed from this region. And so there is a concerted effort to also engage politically and security-wise to, preserve effective multilateral system, but also ripe the economic benefits of a key geographic area for the global economy and also for European interest. We should be straightforward about our national interests, and we can explore what that means and how a connection works, perhaps further on in this conversation.
Thank you. I'm glad that you brought up the presence part, right? And then in terms of presence, I think in 2021, the military presence from some of the European actors were really vivid, as we've seen the UK, we've seen the French and the German warship being deployed in the South, in the Indo-Pacific, and some of them going through the South China Sea.
Yes.
But 2022 was the presence was a little bit, let's just say, lesser in terms of tempo, lesser in terms of visibility, which leads to the questions of whether EU engagement, military-wise, will be something in the long run or not.
That's a very, very good question, because of course the so-called international rules-based order is facing the challenges not just in this neighborhood, but closer to home, closer to my European home. And not just because of Russia's war in Ukraine, but also because of the growing turbulence in Southern Europe, in the greater Mediterranean. And so, absolutely true that our attentions have been concentrated elsewhere. Mind you, the Indo-Pacific is an all-encompassing geographic scope, to the extent that with the joint communication for the Indo-Pacific, we've had an extension of coordinated maritime presence operations through new maritime areas of interest in the northwestern Indian Ocean. And that makes perfect sense because, of course, France has territories, citizens in the northwestern Indian Ocean, but we also have energy interests specific to energy security, which is even more important nowadays because of Russia's war in Ukraine. So you can see that, of course, national interests really drive our focus of attention. But there is constant reference, including in the European Union Strategic Compass, of the willingness to expand the maritime areas of interest past the Indian Ocean, east of the Indian Ocean, to include the Pacific. The problem is that it will require unanimous votes at the European Union's Council, meaning that all countries need to be on board to extend a new maritime area of interest. And it's possible that the lowest dangling fruits will be those that are specific to enforcing UN Security Council regulations. For instance, monitoring of UN sanctions against North Korea, because Russia and China have actually been on board the monitoring of UN sanctions against North Korea, and so in the East China Sea, and there are German, French, UK assets that have been doing their core activities, including the Bayern, which has transited, yes, through the South China Sea. The Bayern, through its maiden deployment to the Indo-Pacific, its core activities, and this is little understood, were actually in the East China Sea to enforce UN sanctions against North Korea with Japan and like-minded players. And so it's possible that the Western Pacific may be a key area for EU involvement. Mind you, when I say EU, coordinated maritime presence operations, there is still a chain of command that it's at the national level, but there is an interoperability and there is a coordination between European navies that makes it a distinctively EU kind of initiative. There is a subsequent possibility of extending the maritime area of interest to the Pacific Islands, but again, this is especially a French interest, and it is possible that other European players are not that interested, precisely because of the war in Ukraine, which is triggering all sorts of economic, energy, food fallouts, including stagnation, if not a recession, and inflation. And that recession and inflation will certainly impact on the political and economic capacity of sending assets that are very expensive. These missions are very expensive. And so we get to your earlier point about the South China Sea. I see presence operations there not through an EU proper level, but at the individual state level. And yes, it's true that there has been less visibility, but France has reiterated that it will keep doing what they call routine exercises, which is different from what the US Navy calls freedom of navigation operations. So it's basically operations in defense of freedom of navigations. And perhaps they are less provocative than the US and to some extent even the UK. But we've seen Germany sending fighter jets this year all the way to Australia and then to perform military exercises closer to Japan. What is also very interesting is that Italy comes into the picture, because the strategic concept of the Chief of the Defense Staff, published in June of 2022, has made it clear that the Indo-Pacific is also a priority for Italy as a region, broadly defined. And since there has been a presence of other fellow European key players, such as Germany, which has, by the way, reiterated that it will commit, at the very least biannually, to these dispatches, and France, of course, and even the Netherlands, which has accompanied the HMS Elizabeth in its maiden trip to the Indo-Pacific, Italy is potentially likely to go to follow through in the incoming future. So watch the space, because if Italy, a merchant nation, which has churned out its own implementation strategy for the Indo-Pacific in February of 2022, and this is a very little known fact, the document is in Italian, it was hidden in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website and published, unfortunately, on February 22, 2022. So 2 days before Russia's war in Ukraine, where all the world's attentions have been elsewhere. Italy has nonetheless committed, yes, to this protection of effective multilateralism and of the rules, the so-called rules-based international order, but also to ride the benefits of an engagement in the region. And I encourage the listeners to this podcast to watch the space, because if, and this is conditional, Italy follows through its own ambitions, it means that we will get a more distinctively European dimension, and that's going to be fascinating also as an Italian for me to witness.
Why wasn't it publicized as widely as the French version or the even the Netherlands, the Dutch equivalents? It got some publicity.
Because Italy has actually been a supporter of the non-paper churned out by France, Germany and the Netherlands in support of a strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, along with other member states such as Poland. But it has always kept a lower profile because, of course, resources are finite, political capacity is also limited in a country that has witnessed also a degree of short-lived governments, and of course, because very simply, our perimeter of interest is really the broader Mediterranean. And of course, that is still the Indo-Pacific. And so Italy has also, to date, still to commit, and it will commit in all likelihood, to coordinated maritime presence operations in the expanded maritime area of interest in the northwestern Indian Ocean, because we have to secure energy resources from the Gulf. And it's a low-dangling fruit. But in all likelihood, much of it was also bad luck, as we say in Italy. The ministerial forum on the Indo-Pacific launched by the European presidency, the European Union's Council presidency of France on February 22 of 2022, unfortunately happened just before heaven broke loose, all heaven broke loose with Russia's war in Ukraine. And this is also reflected by the strategic compass, which is now pointing at different dynamics, meaning the importance of strengthening NATO. So again, we are, yes, stressing strategic autonomy at the European Union level, but to be a bit snarky here, clearly we are actually strategically dependent on the US as well for the security of our own continent. And so our attentions are closer to home. But precisely because we have received support from the US, Japan, Australia in our fight and retaliation against Russia's war in Ukraine, I'm sure that there is an expectation from our friends and partners in the Indo-Pacific for us to do more. But again, we are perfectly cognizant that we need to avoid self-fulfilling prophecies. And this is my normative assessment. Self-fulfilling prophecies and action-reaction dynamics that will make us all poorer. So to take into greater consideration not just Chinese assertiveness, but also the security dilemma at play in the broader region.
Thank you. I would like to follow up on one of the points that you mentioned earlier. You said that we might expect more stable military presence of European navies in the future, and some of which might be less provocative. How would you define being provocative?
Right.
Is freedom of navigation's operation, is it?
So this is a bit tricky because I'm not a military expert, and I have to warn your listeners. I'm mostly preoccupied with political and economic dynamics. Hence, also how you can see my argument being developed. My understanding is, however, that in a plethora and set of different activities, it's clear that routine exercises and operations in defense of freedom of navigation, for instance, in the South China Sea, in all likelihood, are not performed within the 12 nautical miles of the geographic features that are contested in the South China Sea. There's another additional factor which should be emphasized, and that is that yes, China has been aggressive very much in the region, but that aggressiveness should also be and can also be understood as a reactive aggressiveness stemming from China's own insecurity. And so my analysis points at the US Navy, for instance, committing its own assets at sea on a particular definition of UNCLOS, which the US has not ratified, by the way, according to which the US has the capacity to send its assets to perform intelligence, reconnaissance and surveillance all the way to China's backdoor. This, of course, reinforces the insecurity of China's military bases in Hainan and the fear that its People's Liberation Army Navy can be bottled up within the first island chain. And hence you see the militarization of the South China Sea and especially of the Paracel Islands with these sonars and these communication systems aimed at detecting military assets and whatnot. So clearly there is at play an action-reaction dynamic. The trick is to find a balance between deterrence, yes, but also reassurance to avoid the worst. And this very same logic, if I may conclude, is also seen, in my understanding, through capacity building programs that are connected with this maritime security fiefdom, with this maritime security realm. And so the European Union, especially Expertise France and the French Technical Cooperation Agency, have launched this, have expanded its this CRIMARIO, Maritime Domain Awareness Capacity Building Program, premised on its specific software and platform called IORIS. It is really, at the core of it, it is a tool aimed at development cooperation and maritime safety to empower local coast guards. Also for transnational security threats such as illegal fishing, piracy, but potentially for what we could call soft balancing, because of course maritime domain awareness gives you a clearer picture of all sorts of assets at sea. Now compare this with the US launched really Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness framework or platform, which is still in its infancy. It was launched at the Quad Summit of April 2022 in Tokyo. That particular platform, which is nominally about illegal fishing, according to even first-hand interviews with National Security Council members of the Biden administration, is really aimed at competition with China. Because if you understand the technology, and you should be aware that I don't, so if you have technical questions, unfortunately you won't find them in my article. But first-hand testimonies that I also cite in the article suggest that there was a degree also of frustration among Quad members, because clearly there was a lot of sugarcoating about the IPMDA for illegal fishing, but it was really aimed at military competition with China to spot, yes, fishing vessels, but also especially paramilitary grade zone fishing vessels, but also potentially war vessels. And so how is this going to be welcomed by Southeast Asian littoral states that have territorial and maritime disputes with China? Certainly, they might choose both Primario and the IPMDA. But I still see a difference, and I still see the possibility that the technology can be used for the strategic competition purposes that may not necessarily fully align with the goals and objectives of littoral states in Southeast Asia that have territorial and maritime disputes with China.
You know what? I'm glad that you have brought up Primario and IPMDA because, you know, from the perspective of the countries potentially could be beneficiaries of those initiatives. I feel like when there are a lot of offers coming at once, and the offers are pretty much the same. So Primario also contained a iOS software, right, that aims at tracking ship vessels, you know, monitoring the development on the ground. IPMDA equipped with Sea Vision doing pretty much the same thing. And I think there are others, actors like India, who is also pushing for their own Indian Ocean initiative with some sort of MDA element. Do you think there would be confusion among regional countries when they are being offered such initiatives? Or do you think there would be a way maybe to synergize all those initiatives before they are being offered to the regions?
That's a very tricky question because, of course, we need to go back to the starting point, which is, yes, the technology may be, if not compatible, may be suppletive. It may be used hand in hand, and so all the better. But what is fascinating here is to look at it through the prism of the interests of the proponents of that technology and how that technology can be used to advance their own goals. And of course, Italy, for instance, has its own MDA platform, which is distinct from the French one. And India, of course, would have its own MDA platform because traditionally South Asia has been India's own sphere of influence. So there is a willingness also to keep a balance within one's own domain, so to speak, and to avoid the intrusiveness, potentially, of other players. And so there is this question of, can you really trust the technology of like-minded players, quote-unquote, if, for instance, it can actually be more intrusive than expected? And this is no easy talk, this is no cheap talk. It's just that information technology such as this can be intrusive, and you really need to build trust. And you really need to align the planets of trying to adapt our own respective national interests. And unfortunately, I still see a lot of cacophony because they are divergent. And I see this at play, of course, in the economic field. That's why I push the idea in the article of mercantile interest, precisely because we live in a time and age where we shouldn't be fixated with geopolitical competition solely and ideological confrontation. Unfortunately, and this is my pessimism trickling down, the ideological competition that we're witnessing nowadays is also a return of nationalisms writ large. And those nationalisms feed into industrial policies and the enhancement of specific technological developments at home at the detriment of others, not necessarily just of China, but also of like-minded players. The European Union is frustrated from within. Think about the industrial subsidies, the fiscal policies of Germany, and the recriminations from France and Italy and other players in Italy, but also between the EU and the US. So there is still actually scrape the surface of friendshoring and of like-minded players, quote-unquote. There is a lot of tension because as we're witnessing also a technological leap forward, we are at the dusk, really, at the beginning of the fourth industrial revolution. It makes perfect sense for a state to promote the key technologies of its own industries to gain first mover advantage, and how to adjust then those national interests to ripe the benefits of being first mover advantage technology-wise, also in the context of a geopolitical competition, but it's not necessarily of course, the US against Europe. Quite the contrary. It's quite a hard task for India as well.
Well, I think we had a lot of chats about the technical side of things, so I would like to just, move back to the political side of the South China Sea. Yes. Back in 2016, when the tribunal ruling came out, the EU was about to come up with a response to the award, right? And then there was a rumor that internal divisions was what delayed the response and watered down the response eventually. Then in 2021, I noticed that the EU's was much quicker, much more responsive. Whenever something happened on the ground in the South China Sea, they would be releasing a statement pretty quickly, pretty timely. For example, when there was hundreds of fishing boats gathered at the Western Reef, right? You saw a statement right away.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Would you say that indicate more unison within the EU member, considering how they view the South China Sea, or does it indicate a stronger sense of threat?
Yes, I think that we've come of age in our assessment of China's behavior. 2016 response to the ruling by an arbitral tribunal set up by UNCLOS was effectively watered down by Hungary, Greece, and Croatia. What we've witnessed has been a growing but steady, clear-eyed view of the China challenge, but has led us in 2019 to the so-called tripartite China strategy within the EU that posits that China is, yes, a potential partner for transnational security challenges, but it's also an economic competitor, and that necessitated level playing fields initiatives, both at home and abroad, but also a strategic rival. And with COVID-19 pandemic, wolf warrior diplomacy, China's heavy-handed behavior through what is known as wolf warrior diplomacy in Europe, and coercive informal sanctions against Lithuania, we have also witnessed a growing willingness to stand up to China. And this, of course, has gone hand in hand with a recognition that Europe can play a security role, not just by sending assets, but also through capacity building. And this is evident, of course, through note verbals within the United Nations. France, Germany, and the UK especially have been very vocal on defending the 2016 ruling. It is a very interesting ruling, that one, because it amounted not just to debunk China's maximalist claims of the South China Sea as effectively internal Chinese waters, but also to the fact that the geographic features in the South China Sea did not amount to islands, and so they had no exclusive economic zone, and that wasn't necessarily well received by many players, including European players, because some of the features detained by European players do not necessarily amount to islands that should have an EEZ. That's why there was also this kind of tricky balance in accepting the 2016 ruling, not necessarily because of China, but because of one's own national interests. But again, I think we are coming of age vis-a-vis China. My claim, however, is that yes, we are tilting closer to the perception of our friends and partners that have churned out their respective Indo-Pacific strategies or outlook. And it's pretty much a Rorschach test. They're very different, but without full alignment with a maximalist approach that aims at full-blown containment. Also because, of course, the threat perception is not as stark as the one faced by some key regional players such as Japan, or even the US, which of course has traditionally been a hegemonic player in this corner of the world.
So as far as I can see from your talk, it's more about a heightened sense of threat, right? A more unified approach to how you view your own security threat. how about the values of the South China Sea by itself? Okay, so we know that some of the European powers, they have territories in the Pacific.
Yes.
But some others don't.
Yes.
Right? And some others have trade volume that pass by the South China Sea, but the others do not have that much of a trade volume that go through the South China Sea. What do you think will be the best way to sell, to convince, your European citizen, of the importance of the South China Sea? Why you, at the same time, have so many other concerns, other parts, other oceans that you have to worry about?
Well, as the Czech ambassador to Vietnam has made clear in a speech today, inaugural speech, about 30% of European trade with the region goes through the South China Sea. And so even landlocked Czech Republic, which has been very vocal, incidentally, during its presidency of the European Council, the EU Council, in churning out and carrying forward the torch of the strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. Even landlocked countries depend very much on trade that passes through these stormy waters. The same applies to Taiwan, to cross-strait tensions. We depend, and incredibly so, to the high-end technology that Taiwanese companies such as TSMC semiconductor company produces through regional value chains in Taiwan. And so it is in our own interest to make sure that these sea lanes are kept open with freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, and again, to drive in the earlier concept, it is in the interest, and this is a more philosophical point, it is in the interest of the European Union, which is an intergovernmental and supranational organization made of small and medium powers. It is in the interest of these small and medium powers to preserve the international rules-based order, precisely because if we end up condoning and accepting a world defined by might makes right and by the law of the jungle, we are going to lose. We are going to lose our own peace and prosperity, precisely because we don't have the real capacity to act as geopolitical players with the very strong voice that others, such as the United States, of course, or China have. So it is important to keep the rules going, and this very same philosophy has been feeding at the very core also our strong reaction against Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. Because if we condone one of the very basic tenets of international law, which is the settlement of disputes through peaceful means rather than coercive ones, we're going to open the doors for a world defined by the law of the jungle, and that is incredibly tough for an organization made up of small and medium powers.
Well, I think that is beautiful way to conclude the podcast. Thank you so much, Dr. Giulio Pugliese. Yes, it's very late, and you had traveled from a very far distance to be here with us at the South China Sea Conference. So once again, thank you, and I hope the podcast today will open up some further discussions in the future.
Thank you.
And also for the listeners as well.
Thank you. And I encourage the listeners to read the article called The European Union's Security Intervention in the Indo-Pacific between multilateralism and mercantile interests. Thank you so much, Hoang. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
That is for this week. Stay tuned for our new episodes, which will be released on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, as well as Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Thank you for listening.